Hello and welcome to our discussion on the regulation of breathing, also known as the regulation of ventilation. So, for example, if we have two people, one who is at rest and the other person was exercising and immediately got off the treadmill, and you set them both next to each other, obviously you would see an increased rhythm of breathing or an increased rhythm of increased rate of breathing with the person who is exercising, whereas the person who is sitting at rest has a maintained baseline rate of breathing. So obviously we see that the control of breathing is affected by physiological circumstances like the excruciating need for oxygen supply, in addition to the excruciating need to vent off carbon dioxide, as well as the excruciating need to bring the pH back to homeostatic level, because we know that homeostatic pH, the pH of homeostasis, is between 7.35 up to 7.45, whereas below 7.35 you would have an acidic beginning of acidosis, while 7.45 and above that would initiate the beginning of alkalosis. So today we will learn what are the factors that modulate and affect your rate of breathing. We will also learn about who is behind the control of your rhythm and rate of breathing. We will learn that there is a triad of systems: your nervous system, as well as your cardiovascular system, and your respiratory system. Those three affect your rate of breathing. There is a homeostatic feedback arc. So this arch will input to the nervous system that we need to increase our rate of breathing because there is so much carbon dioxide and metabolic waste being built up in our blood. That's why we need to increase the rate of breathing. We will also learn, for example, that we need to decrease the rate of breathing in cases where we have alkalosis. So we need to preserve carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is synonymous with acidity. So the higher the partial pressure for carbon dioxide, obviously, the more acidosis we will have. Okay, so remember, your nervous system. Your nervous system will innervate, will send action potentials to inspiratory muscles to regulate your inspiration. It will also send inhibitory signals to stop your inspiratory muscles from action and, in fact, initiate your expiratory muscles. So we will learn today how does this nervous system with its action potentials and nerves and these neurons will obviously innervate the muscles, your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm, and those signals, those action potentials are behind the anatomical rearrangements that happen in your breathing. Okay, it is your diaphragm moving. The diaphragm is a muscle, so the diaphragm is a muscle that is innervated with nerves, and it receives input. In fact, it receives output. It receives motor output from your central nervous system that makes it contract in order to widen and increase the volume of your respiratory system. Also, your intercostal muscles receive input from your central nervous system to modulate their volume change. Because we know once we control the volume, we are also able to modulate the pressure. So, in order for us to take a deep breath and for air to flow from the atmosphere into our lungs, we need to create a pressure disparity, because we have learned that fluids encompass liquids and gases. Fluids will never flow except from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. And what I've mentioned in the past, that we have seen this in the heart, that in your atria, when the atria depolarize, that signifies so much pressure. When the atria depolarize, they contract, and once the atria contract, the blood would flow smoothly through the relaxed and open valves. And what led these valves to relax and open? It is the depolarization of the atria and the contraction of the atria, and then the fluid, which is in this case your blood, flew from the atria, which is an area of a higher pressure, to your ventricles, an area of a lower pressure. You will see the same thing in the ventricles. When the ventricles depolarize and contract, then your semilunar valves will relax and open, and then the blood will flow from an area of higher pressure, your ventricles, to an area of lower pressure, your blood vessels, your arteries. Okay, now we're no longer dealing with the blood in that sense. We're dealing with the gas, with air. So in order for air to come into your lungs, you take a deep breath. So how can we create a pressure disparity? We want air to flow in our lungs. That means we have agreed that fluids will never move except from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. So if I want air to come into my lungs, I have to make the pressure within my lungs less than atmospheric pressure. And how can I do that? I can do that by volume, because we have learned that in Boyle's law, once the temperature is constant, the relationship between the pressure and volume will be inverse. So if the volume decreases, the pressure would increase. And if the volume decreases, the pressure would increase. And if the volume increases, the pressure would decrease. So now, in order for me to have the air come into my lungs, in order for me to have the air come to the inside of my lungs, that means the atmosphere has to have a higher pressure than my lungs. So how can I make the pressure within my lungs smaller? That will be to make the volume in my lungs bigger. And how can I increase the volume of my lungs? It is through anatomical rearrangements, where your central nervous system would send action potentials to your diaphragm to make it contract. And the contraction of the diaphragm means it will move down. So now what happens to the size of my respiratory system? When the diaphragm moved down, it increased in volume. Not only the diaphragm moves down, the intercostal muscles would widen and move and expand in a way that makes the transverse diameter of my rib cage bigger. And now I've really made my respiratory system wider, um, vertically, with my diaphragm moving down, and wider also horizontally, with the transverse diameter being more wide and bigger. And I have made the volume higher, or made the volume increase the volume, then the pressure decreased. So the pressure is now less than the atmospheric pressure, and then air flows into my lungs. The opposite, if I want to exhale, that means I want to get the air in my lungs out. So air will never flow, because it's a fluid, it's a gas. It will never flow except from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. So if I want the air to come out, that means the pressure within my lungs has to be more than atmospheric pressure. So how can I do that? Again, with the volume. So I have to make the volume smaller. So if contracting my diaphragm down expands the volume of my respiratory system, then bringing it up would make the volume smaller. So now I initiate the expiration by relaxing the diaphragm, making it move up, making the room of my respiratory system smaller, as well as the transverse diameter would contract. And now I have contract horizontally and vertically, and the volume is decreased. And according to Boyle's law, when the volume decreases, the pressure increases, and then the air within my lungs moves out so smoothly. That is in terms of breathing. Now, how can I modulate how fast do I breathe? Well, there are two variables that are very important. Actually three of them, but we know more about two than the third one. And these three variables are the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the pH, and then you have the partial pressure of oxygen, and we don't have a lot of information about that. What we need to know is that for the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases, that would send that will be detected with peripheral peripheral chemoreceptors. So we have two kinds of chemoreceptors. We will see them in a little bit. These two kinds of chemoreceptors, what do? They are chemoreceptors. They are receptors who detect chemical alterations, receptors who detect chemical changes. So if there is a disparity in carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide partial pressure in the blood. So that means if the partial pressure for carbon dioxide increases, that means my pH decreases. So now I am inching in towards the stressful clinical condition of acidosis. So that means I need to get rid of the carbon dioxide. That problem is a sensory problem. So now we have sensed with sensory neurons, with afferent neurons. Afferent neurons. So afferent neurons are sensory neurons. So the afferent neurons would detect for me changes in the pH. Did the pH drop below physiological pH? What is the physiological pH? We agreed that the physiological pH is a range between 7.35 up to 7.45. So if the pH drops significantly, it will be detected with sensory chemoreceptors that are central. So you need to understand the difference between central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. What is the difference between central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors? Central chemoreceptors will only detect fluctuations and changes in pH, while peripheral chemoreceptors, they are better at detecting fluctuations and changes in the partial pressures of the gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen. But in either case, these two variables, the pH and the partial pressures of these two gases, once they are detected, there are respiratory centers in the brain stem, in the medulla, known as the medullary rhythmicity center, and also in the pons respiratory center. What happens is input is sent to these centers, and these centers now would receive that sensory input through these afferent neurons, and then these centers would integrate the information, meaning detecting, are we dealing with acidosis, or are we dealing with alkalosis, are we dealing with a high partial pressure in carbon dioxide, or a lower partial pressure in carbon dioxide, or a higher partial pressure of oxygen, or a lower partial pressure of oxygen? And then they would send the proper output, obviously different outputs depending on the situations that are detected. And then they send these output signals through efferent efferent neurons, because they target effectors, and these efferent neurons are motor neurons. So we will learn more about that. Okay, so we have learned that there are two types of respiration. There is an external respiration and an internal respiration. An external respiration deals with exchanging of gases between the lungs and the atmosphere. We agreed that the lungs are like an airport in which gases like oxygen is in the lungs. In a functioning lungs, the airport is functioning properly, so that means oxygen would perfuse uh, the blood, and carbon dioxide will be taken up by the alveoli, and then it will be conducted outward to the atmosphere. That's in a functioning airport. But in cases where you have emphysema and COPD, the airport is not working. So what happens is you have this sequestered these sequestered gases that are unable to make their way out in the case of carbon dioxide, are also unable to make their way into the body as an oxygen. So that is an example of external respiration. And external respiration is the ability to exchange gases with the atmosphere. So, in the case of a non functioning lung or a non functioning airport, there will be a very big problem in external respiration. While internal respiration is the exchange of the gases between the tissues of the body, between the cells, because obviously oxygen is very important for oxidative phosphorylasis. Oxygen is very important because it is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Um, so now let's learn about what happens in your nervous system and how does the nervous system regulate the breathing. Obviously, there are sensory. We said that sensory neurons are afferent neurons. Afferent neurons because they sense and they send the input to your breathing centers. So these breathing centers, they have chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors that are central in your central nervous system. You have central chemoreceptors. And we said chemoreceptors that are central are preoccupied with detecting changes in your pH, while peripheral chemoreceptors are more preoccupied and more specialized in detecting fluctuations and changes in the partial pressures of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So what happens is afferent neurons sense, while efferent neurons are responsible for the motor output to the muscles. So they control the muscles. So now let's look to this is a wider picture of what's happening in your nervous system. So there's a detection, a sensation of fluctuation in the pH, the oxygen or the carbon dioxide. That will be sensed where? It will be sensed here in your aortic arch. So you have aortic arch receptors, and you also have carotid chemoreceptors, aortic arch receptors, carotid chemoreceptors. These two kinds of receptors, the aortic arch receptors and the carotid chemoreceptors, these are your two peripheral chemoreceptors. These are your two peripheral chemoreceptors. And it's very important to understand that your aortic body chemoreceptors, in addition to the carotid arch chemoreceptors, these are the peripheral chemoreceptors that would detect changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then they would send sensory input through efferent neurons. These efferent neurons would target your. You have two systems. You have in your. This is happening in the brainstem. Exactly in your brain, it's happening in the brainstem. And in the brainstem, you have your pons and medulla. But the actual center is the medullary rhythmicity center. It is the medullary rhythmicity center. The medullary rhythmicity center is the center that is responsible for regulating the rhythm and rate of your breathing in the medulla. So they would send input signals to these carotid arch chemoreceptors, these aortic body chemoreceptors. They would send their sensory input to your medullary rhythmicity center, where in the brainstem in the medulla, and they would send their appropriate sensory input. Do I have a high partial pressure of carbon dioxide? Do I have a low partial pressure in carbon dioxide? Do I have a high partial pressure of oxygen? Do I have a low partial pressure of oxygen? Do I have a higher than normal pH? Do I have a lower than normal pH? And these fluctuations are not welcomed. That's why we need to do something about it. So then the medulla would integrate, being the computer who received an input, it would integrate and then it would send the appropriate correction output signal through your efferent neurons. And these efferent neurons would target your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm, and then they would change appropriately. So somebody who's running the treadmill for 10 minutes, who comes and has a seat right next to somebody who is resting, that person who will be gasping for air and with a higher rate of breathing and higher and extremely high rhythm in their breathing, hyperventilating. Why? Because the medulla in the person who's running has received the sensory input that you have so much carbon dioxide in your blood, because so much metabolic waste, because the cells are breathing and they are doing their cellular respiration and venting their carbon dioxide into the blood. So carbon dioxide is accumulating in high amounts. So we cannot be breathing at that normal baseline at rest rate of breathing. We need to increase to vent out this carbon dioxide. Okay, so that shows you how the medulla in these two different people are detecting two different stimuli. The person who's running receiving so much carbon dioxide, partial pressure is increased, as well as the pH decreased, because high carbon dioxide means low pH and means high acidity. And then the person would increase their rate of breathing to vent off the carbon dioxide until the pH goes back to the normal homeostatic range of 7.35 to 7.45. This is happening in your brain stem. The brain stem is the part of your central nervous system. The brain stem is the part of your brain that is responsible for regulating your breathing. Where exactly in the brain stem? It's in the medulla. Where exactly in the medulla? You have two groups, one group known as dorsal respiratory group and the other group known as ventral respiratory group. And it is your ventral respiratory group that mainly affects your rate of breathing, and it receives also more input from your dorsal respiratory group. In the pons, in addition to the medulla, in the pons you have another very important pneumotaxic center. This pneumotaxic center, you have in the pneumotaxic center, there's also input that is being sent to the medulla to regulate the rate of breathing. So, what I need you to understand is that you have a triad regulating your ventilation. You have a triad of systems regulating your rate of breathing. It is your central nervous system receiving sensory input through afferent neurons from chemoreceptors that are either peripheral, such as your carotid arch chemoreceptors or your aortic body chemoreceptors in the heart, or it could have central chemoreceptors in your brainstem that detect changes, fluctuations in the pH and fluctuations in your partial pressures. So after they receive the proper input, they would integrate that input. If the input reflects that the homeostasis of the partial pressure of these gases is within the normal range, if the sensory input affirms that there is the pH is within normal range, then the output signal will be to maintain the rate of breathing as is. But if there are changes, meaning an increase in the pH, or a decrease in the pH, an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or a decrease in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, an increase in the partial pressure of oxygen, or a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, an appropriate sensory signal would be sent to your brainstem, especially the medulla and the pons, and particularly the medulla, and the medulla would integrate and understand whether or not there is an increase or a decrease above the range of the homeostatic pH or the homeostatic partial pressure of carbon dioxide or the homeostatic partial pressure of oxygen. Then the medulla would send the proper and the appropriate output motor signal to modify your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, modifying the transverse diameter of your rib cage. And that is very important to ensure and bring back the pH to its homeostatic range and your partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide to its normal range. The last thing I would like to leave you with is that although your breathing and your ventilation is under autonomic control, you must also understand that the cerebrum, your cerebrum is able to override. Your cerebrum is able to override your autonomic, is able to override your autonomic regulation of breathing. So for example, let's say you want to let's say you would like to let's say that you would like to start speaking, or you would like to start singing. You would see that you have some rudimentary control of your breathing as well. So you can stop yourself from breathing, but obviously